Welcome, dreamers, to another journey through time's hidden corridors. I am your guide through the dreaming historian, where ancient mysteries whisper their secrets to those who dare to listen. Tonight, we voyage beyond the mists of time to the glistening shores of ancient Egypt, to a city once crowned as the jewel of knowledge and wonder. We step into the marble-swept colonnades of Alexandria to seek out what remains not in stone or scroll, but in the yearning hearts of those who remember the vanished Library of Alexandria. This is no ordinary tale. It is a meditation on what has been lost, a silent hymn to forgotten books, burnt parchment, and the minds who once dreamed in candlelight beside the great shelves of antiquity. Before we embark on this mystical journey, if these whispers from the past resonate with your soul, let your presence be known through a gentle light, and join our circle of dreamers by subscribing for more nightly journeys into history's hidden realms. Share with us, fellow dreamers, from which corner of the world you are joining tonight's contemplation. Let our global community of mystery seekers connect across time zones as we drift together into the past. Now, settle into comfort, close your eyes, and let the ancient voices guide you into peaceful contemplation. The sea breeze of Alexandria stirs, the lighthouse glows on the horizon, and somewhere, in shadow, the library waits. The sea kissed the shore with a sigh, as though it carried stories it could no longer bear alone. Along the northern edge of Egypt, where the waters of the Mediterranean shimmered beneath a sapphire sky, rose a city carved from ambition, wisdom, and radiant stone. Alexandria. It was not born like other cities. It was summoned into being by the dreams of a conqueror. When Alexander the Great stood upon a strip of coastline in 331 BCE, he saw not just sand and sea, but a portal between east and west, between the known and the mysterious. He imagined a city that would not simply hold armies, but hold knowledge, a place where scrolls would outweigh swords, a beacon for those who sought more than land sought understanding. Though Alexander would not live to see its marble towers rise, his vision was entrusted to Ptolemy, his general and companion. Ptolemy Isoda would shape Alexandria into the very soul of his new kingdom, blending Egyptian grandeur with Hellenistic precision. The streets ran straight like the lines of a sacred text. The architecture whispered Greek syllables through Egyptian limestone. And at its heart, a dream was being built not of gold or glory, but of parchment. At the edge of the harbor stood the colossal pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But it was not the tallest structure that carried Alexandria's true light. That honor belonged to a quieter monument, nestled behind columned halls and gardens perfumed by papyrus blossoms, the great Library of Alexandria. The library, or Mouseion, a place of the muses, was unlike any other. It was not merely a room of books. It was a temple of the mind, a sanctuary where scholars, poets, astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers came together in reverent silence to listen to the murmurs of the universe. They did not pray with incense, they prayed with ink. But before we step inside, we must understand the soul of the city that gave it breath. Alexandria was not built for ordinary sleep. The city dreamed awake. It pulsed with contradictions, Egyptian in soil, Greek in spirit, and yet uniquely Alexandrian in its mystery. Traders filled the agora with dialects from every edge of the known world. Perfumed oils from Arabia mingled with olive presses from Crete. Philosophers debated beneath palm trees, their robes gathering dust from the same streets where sacred ibis wandered freely. Here time itself seemed to slow. At dusk, the streets would glow with the honeyed light of the setting sun, casting golden halos upon the sandstone walls. The sound of lyres and flutes floated from courtyards where students discussed Plato and Demosthenes. Overhead seabirds cried ancient names into the sky, while the stars waited, patient and for their names to be recorded in Alexandrian ink. And amid it all, like the still eye of a great storm, stood the library. To walk its grounds was to walk inside a breath held by civilization. The air itself felt weighty with wisdom. The scent of parchment, cedar wood chests, and melting wax created a perfume no temple could rival. Even the birds seemed to fly more slowly above it, as if aware that silence here was sacred. Inside, the shelves stretched like labyrinths, holding hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Some whispered of ancient laws, others captured the flight of stars, while others still recorded the pulse of vanished civilizations. Each scroll was a soul, each room a universe. To keep such treasures required devotion. And so, the scholars of Alexandria did not merely visit the library. They lived there. The Mouseion was a living entity, filled with dining halls, lecture rooms, botanical gardens, and astronomers' towers. Scholars walked its marble paths barefoot, in quiet meditation, as if not to disturb the dreams sleeping within the scrolls. They believed knowledge was sacred, and so they copied every manuscript that passed through Alexandria's harbor. Any ship that arrived was searched. Its scrolls were borrowed, transcribed, and only then returned, sometimes with copies, sometimes not. Alexandria did not ask permission. It collected knowledge like breath, ceaselessly and with divine purpose. And so it grew, not just in size, but in spirit. By the time of Ptolemy II, the library was set to house over 500,000 scrolls, written in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Sanskrit, and tongues now long forgotten. The entire intellectual memory of the ancient world rested here, asleep and dreaming. It was here that Euclid mapped the geometry of the heavens, that Eratosthenes measured the earth with astonishing precision, that Herophilos dared to chart the workings of the human body, opening the mysteries of anatomy for the first time. Here, the stars were named, myths were recorded, and the gods were debated with the softness of candlelight. But even as it reached its golden age, the library was never truly safe. Outside its walls, empires shifted like sand. Romerosa's fires were stoked by politics, and the ambition of kings burned brighter than reason. Knowledge, while sacred to some, threatened others. Yet inside, the dream persisted. And in that dream we find ourselves now walking slowly through its columns, hearing the scratch of stylus upon scroll, smelling the oil that lights the scholar's lantern, and feeling the weight of time pressed into every corridor. The city outside begins to dim. Torches are lit. The waves continue their eternal hymn against the stone harbor. And in the distance, the lighthouse glows like a promise. For now, Alexandria lives, and the library breathes. Let us step further in. Let us listen to the whispers between scrolls, and seek the mystery of how such a wonder could vanish, not in a moment, but in 1,000 silent sighs of history. Beneath the rose-gold light of the Alexandrian dawn, the great portico of the Mouseion stood like a gate between worlds, not only the mortal and the divine, but between silence and speech, ignorance and understanding. This was the house of the Muses, where the breath of every discipline, astronomy, poetry, mathematics, medicine, converged into a single, sacred exhalation. To enter the Mouseion was to enter the sanctum of the universe's memory. Unlike temples devoted to gods of war or commerce, the Mouseion did not house idols carved from stone. Instead, it venerated 9 unseen deities, the Muses, each the spirit of a different wisdom. History, tragedy, lyric, poetry, astronomy, even dance. Their presence was felt not in icons but in the steady rhythm of writing, the murmur of scholarly conversation, and the echo of footsteps on marble floors lined with ancient texts. The structure itself, commissioned and expanded by the Ptolemies, was unlike anything else in the ancient world. It was more than a library. It was a living engine of knowledge, a research institute, university think tank, and sanctuary for the intellect. Its layout resembled that of a palace, but its soul was woven from scrolls. Within its central halls, columns soared skyward, flanked by alcoves and reading chambers. Some walls bore inscriptions in Greek and Egyptian, while others remained bare, as though the builders knew that even stone must sometimes remain quiet in reverence. Shelves lined every visible surface, often extending to unreachable heights, where scrolls were accessed by ladders and pulley systems. The ceiling was painted in deep blue, dotted with golden stars to mirror the heavens that scholars here so often studied. There were no kings within these halls, only thinkers. The Mouseion attracted the greatest minds of the age not by royal decree, but by gravity of vision. Callimachus, the brilliant poet and created a vast classification system for the scrolls, a forerunner of the modern library index. Aristophanes of Byzantium, the grammarian, refined pronunciation and punctuation. Even Archimedes, from distant Syracuse, sent treatises and corresponded with scholars who paced these colonnades. They came not to possess knowledge, but to be possessed by it. Each scholar was housed within the Mouseion itself, given residence, food, and a stipend, not to produce commodities, but to contemplate. These were not scribes hurried by the demands of patrons, nor clerics beholden to door. They were seekers, dreamers, quiet architects of the unseen. Daily life at the Mouseion followed no strict schedule, yet it flowed like a ritual. At dawn, scholars often gathered in the gardens, beneath olive trees and papyrus stalks, to share dreams or questions that had haunted their sleep. One might ask, what lies beyond the sphere of fixed stars? While another posed, what is the true weight of silence between words? Afterward, they returned to their studies, reading, translating, debating, and writing. There was no division between science and art. A mathematician might compose hymns, a physician might ponder music's effect on the heartbeat. Here, disciplines interwove like vines, and learning was not linear, it was cyclical, spiraling, alive. And at the center of all, the scrolls waited like patient teachers. These scrolls were not bound in leather tomes, nor printed with inked perfection. Each was a roll of papyrus, sometimes stitched together in sections, meticulously copied by hand. Some bore the handwriting of sages long turned to dust. Others were translations of older works, scribed by Alexandrian hands in the quiet hours of candlelight. The scent of these scrolls-aged papyrus, soot, myrrh, was the perfume of memory itself. No one knew exactly how many scrolls the Mouseion held. The numbers whispered by historians range from 200,000 to over 700,000, but the truth is less numerical, more mystical. It was not how many scrolls that mattered, it was what they held. There were epics older than Homer, ritual texts from forgotten kingdoms beyond the Nile, star charts from Babylon, medical treatises from India, mathematical theories born in Persia, poetry from the deserts of Arabia and the icy isles of the north, myths and sciences, rituals and dreams all gathered under one roof. The Mouseion did not discriminate between fact and fable, between myth and mathematics. It preserved them all, understanding that truth often wears many cloaks. The line between legend and history was not a wall here. It was a bridge. Perhaps that is why the Mouseion seemed eternal, not in physical form but in spirit. Visitors who stepped within often described a hush that fell over them, not by command but by presence. Even the most talkative fell silent, overcome by the weight of centuries humming between the walls. One Roman envoy, it is said, wept openly upon entering, declaring he had never known how ignorant he was until he stood among so much knowledge. But even the eternal can be touched by time. Outside the gates, Alexandria danced with the unpredictable winds of empire. The Ptolemies, though founders of the library, were also politicians and warlords. Each ruler held differing views on what the Mouseion should become, some sought to protect it, others to manipulate it. Even within its own halls, quiet rivalries began to stir, as factions debated whether certain scrolls should be translated or sealed, shared or hidden. Knowledge, it turns out, is power, and power is rarely content to stay still. Yet still, the scholars wrote. Still, the muses whispered. Still, the lamps burned through the night, lighting up faces hunched over parchment, eyes wide not with fear but with wonder. And all the while, the sea beyond the city walls echoed a soft rhythm, as if remembering something the world had already begun to forget. One can still imagine it, if one listens closely. The creak of scroll racks, the soft chant of memorized lines, the rustle of linen robes against marble, the sigh of a philosopher mid-thought, the flicker of lamplight reflected in ink. These were the sounds of the Mouseion, the house of the muses, the heart of Alexandria, the soul of a civilization daring to remember everything. And so we linger a moment longer, letting the echoes wash over us. But the wind is beginning to change. Outside, new voices are arriving. Rome watches with curious eyes. Intrigue swells like a rising tide. The library remains still. For now, in the hush of the Mouseion's inner sanctum, beneath vaulted ceilings painted with stars, the cosmos once unrolled like parchment. Here, amid rows of cedarwood shelves and ivory scroll handles, the ancients dared to map the sky not only as it appeared but as it might be understood. This was not the sky of shepherds or sailors, but the realm of philosophers, mathematicians, and mystics. They did not merely observe the heavens, they interpreted them. For within the Library of Alexandria lay scrolls that held the forgotten blueprints of the universe. Some were gifts from distant lands, written in tongues that few Alexandrians could decipher without deep study. Others were translations of Assyrian star charts, Babylonian lunar calendars, Egyptian celestial hymns, Indian treatises on planetary motion. Each scroll was a thread in a great cosmic tapestry, and the scholars of Alexandria wove them into constellations of thought. Here, starlight and scholarship were inseparable. In the cool chambers lit by oil lamps, astronomers like Eratosthenes and Hipparchus paced between stone pillars, eyes lifted toward the heavens, hands stained with ink and wax. These were the first dreamers to sense that the earth was not flat like parchment, but round like a pearl. They measured shadows at noon in Syene and Alexandria, calculated arc lengths between cities, and dared to ask, what is the size of the world? Eratosthenes, the humble librarian with a heart tuned to geometry, devised a method so elegant it still stirs. Using only the length of shadows and the distance between two cities, he calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, more than 2 millennia before satellites would confirm what he intuited beneath the stars. These were not guesses, nor divine revelations. They were dreams born of data, carved from observation and shaped with reason. Elsewhere in the library, ancient texts spoke of the movement of the planets. The Chaldean astrologers had long tracked the erratic dance of Mars, Venus, Jupiter, wandering stars that did not obey the same rules as the others. Alexandrian scholars took these records and refined them, comparing the old rhythms with new patterns. They built models of celestial orbits from wood and bronze, turned them in their hands, and whispered to one another of hidden harmonies between spheres. Some believed in epicycles, tiny circular motions within greater circles. Others pondered elliptical truths far ahead of their time. One early thinker, Aristarchus of Samos, even suggested that the sun, not the earth, might be the center of all. A whisper of heliocentrism, long before Copernicus, tucked into the library's shelves like a seed awaiting its spring. These scrolls were not simply repositories of knowledge, they were portals to imagination. One contained the description of a star so bright it rivaled the Muna supernova seen over China and recorded in cuneiform centuries earlier. Another detailed the phases of Venus, drawn in careful ink circles beside equations for angular momentum. Some scholars even compiled stellar catalogs, assigning numerical values to the brightness of each fixed light, creating the first magnituza system we still use today. But even amid this pursuit of measurement, the dream never faded. For these scholars did not divide science from spirit. The stars were guides, yes, but also guardians. The constellations were not just arrangements of light, but stories etched into the sky. Orion the hunter, Scorpio the avenger, Andromeda the chain. To trace these shapes was to remember the myths of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, alike each story preserved like a sacred constellation of its own. And so the cosmos, as imagined in Alexandria, was both map and mirror. It reflected the inner longings of the human soul to understand, to belong, to be part of something infinite. One can still imagine the quiet moments that unfolded between scrolls and stars. A scholar unrolling a brittle scroll, tracing ancient glyphs with reverent fingers, the soft crackle of firelight, the sound of a bronze astrolabe clicking into place, the patient murmurs of two minds debating not for victory, but for clarity. The library's sky chamber, some say, held models of the heavens, crafted from wood, glass, and gilded thread. When the sun struck the open atrium, the models would glow, casting orbs of golden light upon the tiled floor. The scholars called it the Dome of Dreams, where the orbits of thought circled endlessly. Yet even as this celestial work blossomed, there lingered the ache of imperfection. The scribes knew how fragile papyrus was. They knew that fire could devour 1,000 years in an instant, and so they copied obsessively, translating sky lore from one language to another, hoping to safeguard it from the winds of war and time. But even knowledge wrapped in care cannot always escape fate. Centuries later, many of these scrolls would be lost. Some burned, others rotted in forgotten corners of collapsed buildings. Some were carried off by conquerors who saw only trophies, not truths. The skyber remained silent, watching, waiting. Tonight, when you look up, know this. Much of what we know about the stars once rested in Alexandria's embrace, and much of what we have forgotten still lingers in the spaces between stars, waiting perhaps for dreamers to remember. The scrolls are gone, but their constellation remains. The whisper of ash does not announce itself with thunder. It comes quietly, borne on winds that once carried the scent of papyrus and ink. In Alexandria, those winds would one day shift not with the rhythm of the sea, but with the heat of something far more tragic. Fire, not a single blaze, not one cataclysmic night of destruction, but many small, smoldering moments, each one kindled by conquest, confusion, or careless hands. The story of the library's destruction is not written in a single chapter. It is fragmented, like the very scrolls it once cradled. And yet, even fragments can burn. The first shadow fell in the wake of a great named Julius Caesar. It was the year 48 BCE, and Alexandria stood at a precipice, entangled in the bitter feud between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. As civil war gripped the city, Caesar arrived not as a destroyer, but as a man tangled in love and politics. He came with soldiers, strategy, and the unmistakable weight of Rome. The harbor, once the artery of Alexandria's dreams, became its battlefield. To protect his fleet from enemy ships, Caesar ordered them set ablaze. Flames leapt from mast to mast, consuming the wooden vessels with ferocious ease. But fire does not honor borders. It leapt from the docks to the shore, from the shore to the storehouse, and according to some ancient voices, from the storehouses to the library's satellite buildings. Strabo, the geographer, and Plutarch, the biographer, offer conflicting tales. Some say only scrolls housed near the harbor were destroyed. Others whisper of wider devastation, but even the smallest loss was a wound to memory. Thousands of irreplaceable text works from Asia, Africa, the Aegean reduced to smoke rising against a crimson sky. And yet, the heart of the library may have endured. For the Mouseion itself, deep within the city, stood silent and shadowed, perhaps untouched. If this is true, Alexandria's hope survived, bruised, but not broken. But fire has many names. Decades passed. Cleopatra fell. Rome tightened its grip. New rulers came bearing new gods, new laws, and new fears. The library, though still revered, began to fade from favor. Patronage dwindled. Some scrolls fell into disrepair. Others were sold or scattered. What had once been a beacon now flickered. And then came another flame, subtler but no less devastating. Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria in the late 4th century, ushered in an era of Christian zealotry that saw pagan temples dismantled and ancient shrines defiled. Among the ruins may have stood the Serapeum, a grand temple that housed one of the library's daughter collections. Stone walls carved with centuries of knowledge, scrolls tucked into chambers behind columns dedicated to Serapis, the god of wisdom and integration. Theophilus, under imperial edict, ordered it destroyed. Eyewitnesses spoke of frenzied mobs, statues torn from pedestals, flames licking the painted ceilings, and within the chaos scrolls, fragile and flammable, vanishing in smoke. Again, the truth is uncertain. Some accounts are silent on the matter. Others scream of scrolls burned in heaps of wisdom trampled beneath sandaled feet. What remains is absence and the haunting sense that something sacred was severed. And then, silence. For centuries the Mouseion is no longer mentioned. No travelers record its chambers. No scholars speak of its gatherings. Its very name falls like dust between the lines of history. By the time Caliph Omar entered Alexandria in the 7th century, the library was already a ghost. Later stories accuse him of its final destruction, saying he deemed any scroll not aligned with the Quran as unnecessary. But modern historians doubt this tallit is likely apocryphal, a myth built atop other myths, echoing the grief of a loss too vast to comprehend. For the library did not die with flame alone. It perished and neglected in transition, in the reshuffling of empires and faiths. It eroded like limestone in the salt air slowly, silently, inevitably. And so the fire of Alexandria was not a moment. It was a long extinguishing. Each war, each ruler, each wave of cultural shift took a handful of scrolls, a generation of scholars, a thread of memory, until, one day, the shelves stood bare. The ink turned to dust, the gardens fell to weeds, and the dreams written on papyrus curled in upon themselves, vanishing without sound. Yet, in the wind, the fire still speaks. Even now, one can stand near the harbor ruins, close their eyes, and imagine the faint scent of burning parchment, not of destruction but of memory smoke curling into the sky, carrying the last syllables of lost poems, the final numbers of forgotten equations, the last names of civilizations whose only remains are embers in the collective soul. But every ember can ignite a new flame. Though the library is gone, its spirit endures in every page turned, in every star observed, in every question whispered to the night. We are the inheritors of its ashes. We are the dreamers the fire could not silence. Among the fading echoes of the great library, one presence lingers most quietly of all the librarians. Not the keepers of mere order, but guardians of memory, stewards of mystery, and dreamers in service of the muses. Their names, for the most part, have drifted away, carried like fallen petals by the winds of time. Yet their work endures in the shadows, in the structure of every archive, in the quiet reverence of every hand that lifts a book in silence. These were not clerks. They were philosopher archivists, chosen not only for knowledge, but for wisdom. Their task was monumental to catalogue the thoughts of the world. When a scroll arrived in Alexandria, it did not simply join a shelf. It was examined, classified, cross-referenced, and often copied by hand. The librarian's role was not to possess the scroll, but to understand its place in the great web of knowing. At the heart of this sacred endeavor was one luminous figure, a poet by craft, a scholar by calling. Callimachus created the first true library catalogue the world had ever seen. His system, known as the Pinex, was a monumental undertaking, one that listed each scroll by subject, author, and opening line, sometimes even noting the scribe in the dialect. It spanned 120 volumes. In Callimachus's hands, knowledge became a garden, each scroll a seed, each genre a vine, each name a bloom. He tended it not with shears but with song, believing that poetry and order were not opposites, but reflections of a deeper harmony. He did not merely stack scrolls by topic. He sensed their music. He placed Homer beside Hesiod not for chronology, but because they shared an echo. He grouped mathematicians not just by theorem, but by temperament. Euclid's calm geometry next to the passionate spirals of art. And through his Pinex, the library became more than a building. It became a living constellation of thought. Other librarians followed in his footsteps. Zenodotus, the first to hold the position of head librarian, corrected Homeric texts with gentle hands and sharp eyes. Aristophanes of Byzantium refined Greek grammar, placing breathing marks and accents that would guide voices centuries later. Eratosthenes, while charting the earth, still returned each evening to walk the stacks, reading by lamplight. They were not removed from the scrolls, they loved them. One account tells of a librarian who wept over a fragment of lost poetry, the ink smeared by his tears. Another speaks of a scribe who fell asleep over a scroll of ancient medicine, dreaming of herbs whose names no longer grew in any garden. In the quietest hours, before dawn touched the harbor with silver, the librarians would light their lamps and walk the corridors. They would not speak, only breathe, only listen, for within those shelves, stories breathed back. There is a legend, whispered by the few who dare to romanticize history, that some librarians heard voices among the scrolls, not ghosts, but memories, the sigh of a philosopher's final thought, the giggle of a poet rewriting a line, the hush of a healer discovering a cure in ancient ink. Perhaps it was the creak of papyrus, perhaps it was the imagination of the devoted, or perhaps it was the library itself alive, in its own way. For when one tends something with reverence, something tends back, and so the librarians became part of the dream. Their robes, once white, were often stained with the dust of old ink and the smudge of wax. Their hands, lined with age, bore calluses from styluses and shelves. They did not sit on thrones, but on stone benches worn smooth by years of contemplation. They asked questions not to impress but to unfold the world. Why do syllables sing? Asked one. What lies between the stars? Asked another. Can sorrow be translated? Wondered a third. And the library answered not with words, but with scrolls. with poetry from forgotten isles, with star charts scratched in the desert centuries before, with medicinal recipes hidden in the footnotes of temple hymns. To be a librarian in Alexandria was to be a priest of memory. You did not own what you preserved, you were its vessel, and as centuries passed and the city shifted, these dreamers remained quiet, steady, unseen. Even as scrolls decayed, they copied what they could. Even as regimes changed, they protected what they must. Even as dust settled on unused wings of the Mouseion, they whispered verses into the silence, as if hoping memory could be kept alive by sound alone. There is no tombstone for no monument for Aristophanes. Their legacy is not in stone, but in the very idea of the library. In every card catalogue, in every index, in every whispered hush beneath library arches, their lives the echo of Alexandria's dreaming guardians. And so we remember them not as names on marble, but as shadows in lamplight, pacing slowly through corridors lined with scrolls, forever tending the memory of mankind with hearts lit by wonder. The fire may have taken their scrolls, but the librarians still dream. Beneath the bustling markets of modern Alexandria, under layers of earth and history, there lies something unseen, not buried treasure, nor a hidden vault, but something more elusive. Echoes, footfalls that no longer sound, shelves that no longer stand, scrolls that no longer whisper. And yet they are there, for though the library is gone in form, it lingers in presence. The city itself remembers. Even as modern buildings rise and the harbor pulses with life, archaeologists and dreamers alike walk Alexandria's ancient quarters with quiet reverence. They do not seek gold. They seek shadows, traces of what once was the greatest sanctuary of knowledge the world has ever known. What remains of the library? Little, in the way of walls or relics. The fire, the floods, and the weight of time were thorough. But listen closely, and you may find what cannot be held. In 2004, beneath the modern-day library of the Alexandrine excavations uncovered a stretch of ancient halls, marble floors, massive stone columns, storerooms whose purpose remains mysterious. Were these part of the Mouseion or a temple nearby? Scholars debate, but the air trembles with suggestion. There are no scrolls, no catalogues, only silence and stone. And yet, for those who kneel and touch the cold floor, there is a heartbeat, a pulse, not of the earth, but of memory. The very soil of Alexandria carries dust from scrolls that once mapped to the stars, from ink that once whispered a philosophy, from hands that once reached across cultures to preserve the voice of humanity. In a quiet corner of the city, near what was once the Serapeum, lie subterranean galleries, tunnels carved deep into bedrock, lined with niches and broken plinths. Some believe these were once the storerooms of knowledge, others say they were catacombs. But in either case, their silence sings. Walk among them, and you might feel the air shift, not in temperature, but in tone as, though 1,000 voices once spoken, there still hum in the walls. And then there are the fragments, a torn papyrus bearing half a sentence in ancient Greek, a charred bit of scroll, its ink too faint to read, a pottery shard with a verse etched in hurried strokes. These are the library's bones, its relics, its quiet remains, found not in vaults, but in debris heaps, in the corners of old temples, in forgotten drawers of European museums, mislabeled and misunderstood. Each fragment is a syllable. Together, they are the lingering poem of Alexandria. But perhaps the greatest echo is not physical at all. It is the very idea of a universal library, one place where the wisdom of all peoples, all lands, all languages could dwell in peace. That idea was born in Alexandria, and though the stone walls have crumbled, the dream has not. The library lives on in every great archive that came after, in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, in the Vatican Library, in the Badleian, in the stacks of the British Library, in the quiet corridors of every place where seekers kneel before the written word. It lives on in the architecture of inquiry, in the way we categorize knowledge, in the sacredness we assign to silence, in the notion that some questions are too beautiful for quick answers. And it lives on in you. Every time you open a book, every time you pause before turning a page, every time you chase an idea deeper than logic can go, every time you sit in darkness and dare to ask, what did they know that we have forgotten? The stones of Alexandria do not speak aloud, but they are not mute. They murmur in sea breeze and sunrise, in the way the city curves toward its ancient harbor, in the strange calm that settles near the ruins of the Serapeum at dusk. Some nights, locals speak of dreams, of walking through endless corridors, of finding scrolls written in no language they can name, of meeting a man in linen robes who offers them a flame and says, remember. Whether these dreams are memories, myths, or something stranger, none can say. But in the city where memory once had a home of marble and mist, it is no surprise that dreams still knock at the door of sleep. The library is gone, but beneath the stone, the echo remains. After a great fire, there is no fame, only the silence that follows, a silence that does not shout or weep, but lingers, heavy and hollow. In Alexandria, after the last embers of scroll and stone faded into soot, the silence became its own kind of monument. It was not the silence of peace, nor of reverent reflection. It was the silence of absence, The corridors of the Mouseion, once filled with murmuring scholars and rustling scrolls, now echoed only with wind. The gardens, once perfumed with herbs and knowledge, lay untended, their sacred geometry broken by vines. Even the fountains, once feeding clear water to philosophers who debated beneath the olive trees, ran dry. And in that stillness, the world changed. For centuries, no new scrolls were copied in the Alexandrian style. The meticulous calligraphy that once flowed like starlight over papyrus vanished from the world's hands. The catalogues of Callimachus disappeared. The annotations of Xenodotus, the poetic classifications, the astrological treatises of Babylonian scholars, the records of ancient rituals from far-off lands all ceased to echo. It was not just Alexandria that suffered. The loss was global, even if unknown to many. The ancient Sanskrit texts that had arrived by caravan, the Egyptian hymns translated into Greek, the early Chinese manuscripts held as rare, the knowledge of distant astronomies, the philosophies that never reached the ears of Rome, the cures for ailments that modern science has not yet rediscovered, all not destroyed in a single breath, but starved of remembrance. Imagine a world where the stars were catalogued for 2,000 years uninterrupted, where medicine grew not from rediscovery, but from continuity, where questions asked in Alexandria were answered in Florence, and improved upon in Kyoto. That world flickered in the halls of the library and then went dark. But silence is never truly empty. In the shadow of that absence, a hunger began to stir. Long after the library crumbled, its legend remained a faint beacon glowing beyond history's fog. Scholars in Byzantium whispered of it. Islamic philosophers in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad tried to rebuild it. Medieval monastics copied fragments they barely understood, scrawling Latin over Greek, hoping to preserve even traces of what once had been. The Renaissance, centuries later, was not a birth, it was a recollection, a remembering of what Alexandria had once dreamed. Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, Kepler all peered into the same sky once measured by her. They asked questions once whispered beneath Alexandria's marble ceilings. They chased truths written in languages they never read, but which had been kept alive by the invisible thread of human longing. In this way, the library became not only a place, but a symbol, a ghostly mother to all who sought wisdom. It hovered over the shoulders of every scholar who dared to ask what if. It appeared in the dreams of poets. It sang in the back of the mind each time a flame flickered beside a book, each time a student touched parchment and felt something deeper stir. And in this silence, another presence grew, a reverence, not only for books but for the idea that knowing is sacred, that truth must be tended like a flame, that when we read, we do not merely absorb or remember. For all knowledge is ancient. Every insight is read. Every story is a thread pulled from a vast, unseen loom that began weaving long before us. And that is why the silence of Alexandria is not an ending. It is a threshold, a moment between breaths, a stillness before the next question. In that pause, we are invited to listen, to let our minds drift through the corridors of vanished wisdom, to feel the weight of scrolls that no longer exist, but whose echoes still shape us, to sit quietly beside the ghosts of librarians and dreamers, to mourn, yes, but also to hope. For where there is silence, there may one day again be song. Where knowledge was lost, curiosity endures. And in every quiet room, in every sleepless night where a seeker opens a book or gazes up at the stars, the library breathes again, not with fire, not with ink, but with yearning. When night fell over ancient Alexandria, it did not bring darkness. It brought a revelation. Beyond the torches flickering in the agora, beyond the soft glow of oil lamps in the mouth, the sky opened like an ancient book, its pages inked in constellations, its margins filled with mysteries. And there, under that ink-black sky dusted with stars, the scholars of Alexandria would gather not to worship the heavens, but to study them. They were not priests, though they honored the divine, not prophets, though they glimpsed the future in the sky. They were observers, thinkers, and translators of celestial rhythm, those who believed that the heavens were not chaos, but harmony, if only one listened carefully enough. In Alexandria, astronomy was not merely science, it was sacred curiosity. Scrolls arrived from Babylon detailing the meticulous planetary records of Chaldean astronomers. Egyptian priests contributed star maps used to align temples and tombs with unerring precision. Indian scholars sent treatises describing lunar nodes and eclipse cycles. The library welcomed them all, gathering sky lore from every horizon, transcribing, comparing, refining. And then came the Alexandrians themselves, those who did not just record, but expanded. Among them was Hipparchus, a quiet genius who, in the 2nd century BCE, studied the heavens not as static patterns, but as moving symphonies. He compared old star charts with his own observations and discovered something astonishing. The stars were shifting, slowly, imperceptibly, but undeniably. He had discovered precession, the wobble in Earth's axis that changes the orientation of the heavens over millennia. And then there was Eratosthenes, not only a geographer but a seeker of cosmic proportion. In the blazing Egyptian sun, he measured shadows cast by obelisks in different cities and from them, calculated the Earth's circumference with startling accuracy. He peered at the heavens not only for beauty but for geometry. Alexandria's scholars understood that the sky was not merely above it, that to chart a star was to chart a piece of the human longing to understand our place in the vastness. In the upper observatories of the Mouseion, tools now lost to time were used with reverent care. Armillary spheres turned like celestial clocks. Astrolabes traced the curvature of the night. Sundials were calibrated with such finesse that they could mark not just hours, but seasonal breathings of the earth. There were whispers, too, of more mystical seekers. Some spoke of a secret room in the Mouseion where scrolls of ancient astrology were kept under locked, manuscripts not just of planetary motion, but of planetary meaning. The belief that the sky mirrored the soul, that the fates of kings were etched in constellations, that each life, however brief, shimmered with a celestial echo. Though modern minds may dismiss such musings, for the Alexandrians they were not superstition. They were attempts to listen to discern harmony in the vast quiet of the cosmos. And as they listened, they wrote. Scroll after scroll flowed from the observatory's maps of the zodiac, calculations of solstices, speculations on comets and eclipses. Some scrolls bore tiny star symbols in the margins, personal notations of art. Others were lined with equations, structured like hints. One scroll, long vanished, was said to contain a stellar lexicon, a glossary of names for stars in every known tongue. Side by side, the scholar who compiled it believed that by uniting the names of the heavens, the world might one day speak one language of wonder. Whether it ever existed is uncertain, but the desire, the longing to understand was real. It was not only men who looked upward. Women, too, found their place among the stars in Alexandria. Though their names were seldom recorded, a few survived. Aglonik, the daughter of an astronomer, who was said to predict lunar eclipses with uncanny precision. Some whispered that she could make the moon vanish, though in truth she'd simply listened to patterns others ignored. The city itself became a kind of observatory. Temples and towers were aligned with solstices and equinoxes. The famous Pharos lighthouse, with its mirrored beacon, became a marker not just for ships, but for celestial navigation. Sailors arriving at Alexandria did not only seek its knowledge, they sought its orientation, both earthly and cosmic. And when the scrolls burned, the sky remained. The stars did not mourn, but they did seem more distant. The maps were lost, the tools broken, but the heavens continued their quiet turning, and new watchers would one day emerge. Even now, when we lift our gaze to the stars, we follow paths first traced in Alexandria. The catalogues of Hipparchus were the bones upon which Ptolemy would build his Almagest. And centuries later, Copernicus would read Ptolemy and ask different questions. The ripples of Alexandrian wonder reached far beyond its harbor. And tonight, as you rest beneath your own sky, perhaps you, too, will feel it. The faint tug of stars remembered. The breath of scrolls long turned to dust. The echo of footsteps upon marble, pacing between observation and revelation. For though the star-seekers are gone, their questions remain, and the sky still waits to answer. There is a rhythm hidden in the world, quiet as breath, ancient as the stars. The scholars of Alexandria believed this rhythm could be found everywhere, in the spirals of shells, the arc of the sun, the intervals of music, the rise of pyramids. It was not superstition. It was not simply mathematics. It was sacred geometry, the belief that the universe itself was built on patterns of harmony and divine proportion. Within the library, where scrolls nestled in silence and minds burned like lanterns, geometry was not a school subject. It was a philosophy of existence, a language through which the world could be interpreted. The library's architects had known this, from the way sunlight poured at calculated angles through the Mouseion's archways, to the symmetry of the colonnades. Alexandria's sacred spaces were built with mathematical reverence. Nothing was arbitrary. Each structure echoed deeper truths, and at the center of this reverence was the mysterious ratio known today as the golden section of proportion, revered not only for its mathematical elegance, but for the strange comfort it gave the eye and the spirit. It appeared in temple walls, in the spacing of amphitheaters, in the petals of flowers depicted in naturalist scrolls. And Alexandrian scholars did not simply admire it, they studied it, measured it, theorized on its place in the human soul. It was said that the golden ratio appeared in the distances between heavenly bodies and the growth of trees, in the spiral of one Alexandrian philosopher, whose name has been lost, called it the fingerprint of the gods. Here, in the library, mathematics was not cold or mechanical, it was alive. Geometry was studied not only for building, but for thinking. The library contained entire sections devoted to the Platonic solisa, sacred shapes believed to be the building blocks of the cosmos. The cube, the sphere, the dome. To study them was to study creation itself. Mathematicians like Euclid, whose name endures, compiled scrolls that laid out the principles of plane geometry, postulates, and theorems written with clarity and quiet majesty. His Elements, assembled in Alexandria, became one of the most copied and transmitted works of the ancient world. It was not just a textbook, it was a map to a mind at peace with the infinite. Other scholars extended his work into 3 dimensions, crafting models from polished wood and bronze, their edges worn smooth by reverent handling. One scroll, Nalos, was said to depict an imaginary city constructed entirely according to harmonic right. Houses, even streets designed to reflect cosmic balance. The idea was clear. When the built world reflects divine proportion, the soul dwells in harmony. But sacred geometry in Alexandria did not end at diagram. It bled into every discipline. Musicians sought mathematical ratios in melody. Physicians used geometric proportion to explain the balance of humors within the body. Architects invoked celestial alignments in the orientation of sanctuaries. Even poets described stanzas in numerical terms, measuring syllables like steps in a temple dance. In one chamber of the Mouseion, rarely opened to the public, it is said that geometric manuscripts were copied onto fine linen, rather than papyrus, so that they could be unfurled like banners, hanging from the ceiling like quiet commandments. These linen scrolls swayed in the breeze, their figures and ratios casting faint shadows on the tiled floor below. A scholar once wrote that walking beneath them felt like walking beneath the scaffolding of heaven, and there were whispers, too, of scrolls that went further still, scrolls that mapped not the geometry of earth, but the imagined architecture of the soul, diagrams that attempted to trace emotion, memory, and consciousness through curves and points. Mystical works, born of both intellect and vision. Were they philosophy or something more? We do not know. The scrolls are gone, but the desire remains, to find pattern in chaos, to find stillness in form, to understand that beauty is not decorative, it is foundational. The architects of Alexandria built more than walls. They built a worldview, and though the library's ceilings fell, and its scrolls turned to ash, the sacred geometry survived. In the Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe, in the Islamic designs of Andalusia, in the rose windows of churches and the mandalas of the East, in every compass-drawn circle of the Renaissance, in every equation that searches for order in the spiraling dance of galaxies, we are still seeking the same thing: the alignment of the inner and outer, the shape of truth, the echo of perfection in a world of Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the marble floor of the library beneath you. Feel the sun's warmth filtered through a skylight aligned with the equinox. Picture the scroll in your lap, a diagram inked with care. You trace the golden spiral with your fingertip, and for a moment, the world makes sense. This is what they sought. This is what they passed on. A geometry not of stone, but of spirit. A harmony that does not fade. In the quiet recesses of the great library, far from the thunder of politics and the elegance of philosophy, there existed a more intimate kind of knowledge. It did not shine like gold nor echo like poetry, but breathed quietly between lines of ink the healing arts. Here, the body was not merely treated, it was understood. The physicians of Alexandria walked softly through the marble halls, their sandals trailing the scent of oils and myrrh. They were not cloaked in superstition nor bound by temple rites. They were students of flesh and breath, devoted to the scrolls that murmured secrets of veins, bones, and pulse. These were the healers. In a world where sickness was often seen as divine punishment or demonic possession, Alexandria offered a sanctuary of reasoned care. The library held scrolls gathered from every known land, Egyptian remedies etched in hieratic Hippocratic treatises from Greece, Ayurvedic principles from the Indian subcontinent, and herbal knowledge passed down through African oral tradition and carefully inked by scribes who respected the earth as teacher. One chamber, shrouded in linen curtains and always perfumed with crushed eucalyptus, was reserved for these scrolls. It was not large, but it was sacred. This was the Hall of Remedies, a place where knowledge did not speak in abstract, but in the language of skin, fever, wound, and healing touch. And among the healers, one name rose like incense in the memory of time. Often called the father of anatomy, Herophilos did not simply theorize the body, he opened it to understanding. In Alexandria, where lore and spirit briefly allowed, he performed dissections with a reverence that bordered on ritual. He mapped the optic nerves, traced the pulsing rivers of arteries, and distinguished the brain, not the heart, as the seat of thought and consciousness. He dared to write that the soul lived not in the chest, as poets claimed, but in the folds of the cerebrum. His scrolls describe surgical techniques, the use of forceps, scalpels, and he detailed procedures for cataract removal and wrote of diseases with startling precision. Some say he even kept a dream journal beside his medical notes, believing that the subconscious could offer insights into bodily imbalances. But Herophilos was not alone. Erasistratus, his contemporary, studied the circulatory and nervous systems. He understood the function of the heart as a pump, not a furnace. He dissected the lungs, described the valves, and noted the functions of muscles and tendons. His drawings, now lost, were said to be so precise that later artists used them as reference centuries afterward. Both men were sensitive to suffering. They did not seek fame, but understanding. They walked not with arrogance, but with the humility of those who knew how fragile life was, how quickly health vanished, how mysterious the workings of the body remained, even under count. And while they wrote of scalpel and sinew, other scrolls held gentler arts, The herbalists of Alexandria wrote in looping script about the cooling nature of mint, the fever-quenching power of willow bark, and the spiritual cleansing of juniper smoga. They catalogued plants by taste and texture, by region and ritual. Some believed that every plant had a planetary signature, a celestial twin guiding its use. In one scroll, now lost to time, a woman healer described how she sang to her herbs before distilling them, believing that vibration sweetened the medicine. She wrote not only of potions, but of comfort, the importance of voice, touch, and presence in the healing act. And so healing in Alexandria was never singular. It was woven of science, of ritual, of curiosity, and compassion. But not all was shared. Some knowledge was too dangerous, too powerful, or simply too rare to be left in the open halls. And so the hidden scrolls were born. These were kept in locked chambers, away from public access. Only trusted physicians, chosen by the chief librarian and approved by the ruling Ptolemaic household, were granted entry. These scrolls spoke of forbidden surgeries, of chemical compounds too potent for careless hands, of mental afflictions treated with shadow and light, of dream interpretation used in diagnosis, of healing practices from distant cultures that defy Greek understanding but proved effective all the same. Whispers suggest that one scroll described a silver needle technique that could numb limbs, another outlined a potion that stilled the breath, anesthesia, centuries before its rediscovery. Were these miracles myths? We do not know. But we do know this: the scrolls were real, and they burned, along with the rest of the library. The Hall of Remedies perished. The drawings were lost. The herbal records vanished. The surgical notes, the planetary diagrams, the soothing lullabies scrawled in the margins of fever, charts all gone. And yet, in fragments, some pieces survived. Galen, the Roman physician, preserved echoes of Herophilus's work. Islamic scholars in later centuries translated pieces of heresy. Medieval monks copied herbal recipes from memory and prayer. And today, modern medicine traces invisible threads back to Alexandria, to the quiet rooms where healing was not just practiced, but purpose. For, in those chambers, the healer was not just a technician. He or she was a listener, a watcher of pain, a comforter of fear, a student of both body and soul. And even now, in sterile hospitals or quiet apothecaries, when a practitioner pauses to place a gentle hand on a shoulder, the spirit of the library lives on, not in papyrus but in compassion, not in marble, but in memory, not in what we can prove, but in what we hope to understand. Within the hushed halls of the great library, not all scrolls could be read with the eyes alone. Some required the ear, some the heart, others whispered in tongues that few even recognized. For the Library of Alexandria was not merely a storehouse of information, it was a cathedral of language, and hidden within its shelves were texts written in scripts long forgotten, dialects so obscure they sounded like riddles, and languages that had no homeland, only memory. This was the library's true miracle. Not only its volume of texts, but its ambition to bring the entire linguistic soul of the ancient world under one roof. It began with the Greeks, of course. The Ptolemies spoke and thought in Greek, and it was the primary language of administration, philosophy, and scholarship. But to limit knowledge to a single tongue would have been to blindfold the mind. And so the librarians turned outward. They gathered scrolls in Egyptian Demotic and hieroglyphic script in Old Persian, Phoenician, Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Berber, Nabatean, and early Arabic. From the East came texts in Sanskrit, Tamil, even rare scrolls in ancient Chinese dialects transported by caravan along the long arms of the Silk Road. Some scrolls came not with a translator, but with a silencer, mute beauty whose voice had been lost, waiting patiently to be heard again. And so the library became not only a sanctuary of scholars, but a crucible for translators. These men and women were not simple interpreters. They were code breakers of the human soul, those who sensed that in every word lay a window, and in every forgotten script, a lost civilization's breath. To them, translation was not merely conversion, it was resurrection. One chamber of the library, called by some the Hall of Echoes, was reserved for this sacred labor. Its walls were inscribed not with texts, but with alphabets, rows of symbols from every known writing system. From the pictographs of the Hierophants to the wedge-shaped Cuneiform, from the looping script of the Libyans to the sacred glyphs of Egypt, and above the doorway a line attributed to the founder Ptolemy I. To read the world is to reunite its memory. In that chamber, scrolls lay in groups, one in an unknown language, another beside it in Greek or Egyptian. Often multiple versions of a single text would be compared, each a variation, each a reflection. The translators did not rush. They waited for the music beneath the grammar. It is said that Callimachus once instructed his scribes to listen to foreign text as if listening to dreams, not for accuracy alone, but for intent, for the way meaning curved between lines. They devised systems to preserve nuanced small symbols for mood, intent, even context. One mark meant a word was poetic, another that it referenced divine speech. A third warned the reader that the original had been lost and reconstructed from memory. In one preserved fragment of a letter found centuries later in Oxyrhynchus, a translator writes, I do not know the word for sorrow they used, but it sounded like the hush before rain. I have chosen the Greek penthos, but even that feels too loud. And so, the library did not merely preserve language, it felt them, it cradled them. It honored the way sound wrapped itself around meaning, the way dialect carried history, the way accent revealed migration and memory. Each script was sacred, each scroll a vessel, but there were other languages in the library, symbolic tongues, numerical codes, scrolls filled not with letters but with geometry, or with sequences of numbers that formed patterns understood only by mathematicians. Some believe these were early forms of cryptography, perhaps used by royal scholars or astronomer priests to encode knowledge too precious or dangerous for open access. And then there were the lost tongues, scrolls recovered from ruins, singed, fragmented, written in alphabets unknown even then. The librarians kept them carefully, hoping that one day a Rosetta Stone might appear. And in the meantime they studied them for patterns, for rhythm, for structure. One scroll, entirely undeciphered, was preserved because, as the librarian wrote, "It sings even though I do not understand its song." These scrolls were not discarded. They were revered as mysteries in waiting. It is believed that the library once held an entire section devoted to sacred speech, prayers, chants, ritual language spoken only during eclipses or the recitations of initiates in long-lost mystery schools. These texts were read aloud in low, reverent tones, not for information, but for transmission, the belief that to hear such words was to awaken something ancient in the listener. And in this way, the library spoke not only through its texts, but through its soundscape. The faint murmuring of multiple languages in one hall, the quiet chant of a translator reading in two voices, the rhythm of fingers tracing unfamiliar letters, the hush that fell whenever a new scroll arrived, in a script no one recognized, an invitation to wonder. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, consider this, that the words you use, the letters you see, the names you speak, all of them are echoes of languages once housed in Alexandria. You carry within your tongue the work of scribes long vanished, whose hands inked the world's memory with care and mystery. And though their scrolls have turned to dust, their languages have not. They live in you, in the names of stars, in the terms of medicine, in the roots of words you speak without knowing their depth. The library may be silent, but language remembers, and so, we listen. History, it is often said, remembers kings and conquerors, philosophers and generals, but in the corridors of Alexandria's great library, among the shelves and shadows, there walked figures whose voices did not thunder, but whose whispers shaped the very breath of learning. They were not always named, their scrolls were rarely signed, but their presence was felt in the subtle margins, in the inked corrections, in the fragments of wisdom attributed to a daughter, a priestess, a philosopher's wife. These women were the invisible architects of knowledge, scribes, teachers, translators, healers, astronomers, and guardians of sacred memory. And in Alexandria they whispered to the stars. Let us begin with the one whose name survived. She was not merely a scholar, she was the final flame of Alexandria's ancient light. Born in the 4th century, centuries after the library's prime yet still within its intellectual lineage, Hypatia lived in a city smoldering with change. The classical world was fading, the Roman Empire fragmenting, and religious fervor rising. And yet, in the heart of this turbulence, Hypatia taught. She lectured on mathematics, on astronomy, on the works of Plato and Ptolemy. Her students came from across the empire to sit at her feet in quiet wonder. She did not dress as the women of her day were expected to dress. She wore the robes of a philosopher. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who served not men, but truth. It is said she wrote treatises on conic sections, edited the Almagest, and constructed astrolabes with her own hands. She rode through the streets of Alexandria in an open chariot, not to seek admiration, but to gather students, to share ideas, to ignite minds. Her father Theon had once been a scholar in the tradition of the library, and he raised her among scrolls and instruments. But Hypatia became something more. She was the last voice of a vanished world. And when the new powers of Alexandria, those who feared the old gods, the old science, the old questions, turned to violence, it was Hypatia they struck down. She was murdered not for what she believed, but for what she embodied, a living link to a time when thought was free, when wonder was sacred, and when the stars were not owned by doctrine. But Hypatia was not alone. Even in earlier centuries, when the Mouseion thrived, women played roles too often forgotten. In the healing chambers, midwives and herbalists passed down knowledge that no man could claim, the knowledge of birth, of grief, of rhythm and renewal. Their remedies were often copied by male physicians and attributed elsewhere. But among themselves, the women preserved oral lineages of care. Some women were scribes, their calligraphy delicate, their margins filled with curious symbols that modern scholars have yet to fully understand. Others were translators, fluent in the tongues of their mothers and grandmothers, trusted to handle rare scrolls from distant lands. And there were women who studied this, not in public forums, but in garden courtyards, in rooms lined with hanging maps and polished stone. These were the sky watchers, those who tracked Lunaphasia's recorded eclipse, marked the rising of Sirius with the flood of the Nile. One scroll, now lost but referenced in a later text, described a group of women known only as the daughters of Neith, who believed that certain stars guided not fate, but intuition, that dreams could be aligned with constellations, and insight drawn down like water from the sky. They sang to the stars, it was said, not with voices raised, but with breath timed to moonlight. They believed that silence itself had a tone. Whether this was science, mysticism, or poetry, we will never know. But in Alexandria there was space for all three. Another scroll, worn and stained, contained herbal remedies annotated in two hands, one neat and firm, another fluid and light. The lighter hand had added, drawing small moons, flowing lines, little waves. Some scholars believe it was a mother and daughter, working together across years, one preserving the science, the other the soul. And then there were the unnamed, the woman who copied an Aramaic myth into Greek, giving it breath across time, the girl who memorized healing chants while sweeping the corners of the mountain, the old woman who taught a young astronomer to mark time by the pattern of tides. They were not recorded in statues or marble, but they were there, in every scroll that speaks of rhythm, of growth, of mystery, in the quiet footprints on marble steps once smoothed by patience, in the way Alexandria, for all its grandeur, listened not only to voices loudest, but to those who spoke with care. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, know this. The stars above you are the same stars they watched. The moonlight that filters through your window once shone upon their parchment. And perhaps, somewhere in the echoing chambers of the library, their voices still linger, soft, patient, wise. The women who whispered to the stars did not vanish, they became the whisper itself. The flames consumed so much, papyrus blackened, ink lifted to ash, wooden shelves splintered into dust. Alexandria's grand halls, once filled with the rustle of parchment, fell silent, and the golden age of knowledge smoldered into memory. But even as a fire swept through the library's bones, there were scrolls that did not burn, not because they were spared by fortune or hidden beneath stone, but because some scrolls were not made of papyrus at all. They lived in breath, in memory, in the careful passing of words from one soul to another. There were spoken scrolls, etched not in ink, but in the winding chambers of the human mind. In Alexandria, before the fire ever arrived, the scribes and scholars understood something that too many forget. Preservation is not always physical. Knowledge lives in stories. Wisdom survives in song, and the deepest truths often escape the page entirely. There were those who foresaw the possibility of loss, and so they whispered their knowledge into the ears of trusted students, embedding whole scrolls into memory. Poets who memorized epics, physicians who sang their remedies to apprentices, mathematicians who shaped formulas into chants, repeating them under their breath until they slept. Some say there were entire circles within the library who practiced oracular. In this way, the content of the scroll was not just read, it was lived. There are tales of a woman who carried the complete poetic works of a vanished island culture in her mind, reciting them once a year in a private garden, or a healer who preserved the entirety of an ancient Indian medical scroll by turning it into a prayer cycle, chanted with every sunrise. Some of these individuals never learned to write, but they knew, and they remembered. These were the living scrolls. The library honored them. One chamber, tucked beside the Hall of Translations, was filled not with books, but with sound. Cushioned benches, curtains to soften, echo, and no lamps, only gentle sunlight filtered through alabaster screens. In this space, knowledge was spoken, not lectured, but shared, not read, but revealed. Some scrolls were read aloud, others performed, a myth recited in 3 tongues, a fable enacted by candlelight, a list of plant names sung as a melody, so that the listener would never forget. And for those who listened, the learning was deeper than reading. It was experiential. The text was not external. It became part of them. Even the philosophers participated. It is said that one Alexandrian sage taught Plato's dialogues through walking meditation, pacing the garden, speaking both sides of the argument aloud, until the student could hear the shift in tone, the questioning heart beneath the logic. This was not passive memory, it was embodied wisdom. Some of these spoken scrolls were eventually lost, but others survived, carried west into Rome, east into Persia, south into Ethiopia, transformed as they traveled, mutating, mixing, but never dying. A Greek myth spoken in the desert became a Berber legend. A healing chant in Alexandria evolved into a Sufism. A geometry lesson disguised as a parable found its way into medieval Europe and was recopied as a monk's marginal note. The form changed. The essence remained. And today, if you look closely, you can still hear them. In lullabies that echo rhythms of ancient epics. In old wives' remedies that mirror lost botanical texts. In architectural proportions passed from master to apprentice without diagrams. In stories that begin with long ago, when the stars still spoke. These are the scrolls that could not burn, because they were never bound to begin with, because the mind is a more durable archive than paper. because the heart remembers what matters. And perhaps that was the greatest truth of Alexandria, not in how it collected knowledge, but in how it shared it, in how it trusted the human spirit to carry light forward, even through darkness. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, close your eyes and listen. There is a scroll within you, a story only you remember, a truth passed down not in text, but in tone. The library burned, but its flame lives on, in your breath, in your memory, in the silence between words, where the eternal whispers wait. Standing sentinel at the edge of Alexandria's harbor, casting its light over restless waves and wandering minds, rose the mighty Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a tower of stone and fire. It pierced the sky not merely as a guide to sailors, but as a symbol. To the scholars of the library, it was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a beacon of knowledge, its flame echoing the purpose of the scrolls, to illuminate the darkness. And just as the lighthouse rose above the city, so too did another structure take shape within, less known, less visible, but no less profound. The labyrinth, not one built of walls and corridors, but of ideas, a mental and philosophical structure preserved within the great library's innermost halls. Together, the lighthouse and the labyrinth formed the soul of Alexandria. Let us first linger by the Pharos. Built during the reign of Ptolemy II, the lighthouse was said to rise over 100 meters high, constructed in 3 tiers, square, octagonal, and cylindrical. At its summit, a fire burned perpetually, its light reflected by polished bronze. Mirrors said to have been crafted with precision unknown to most of the ancient world. Some whispered that it could be seen for over 50 kilometers. Others claimed that it could set ships aflame with its focused beam, though modern minds doubt this tale. Regardless of the legend, it was more than stone. It was a declaration. It proclaimed that Alexandria was a city that watched the world, guided it, and dared to reflect light back into the unknown. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, the lighthouse blazed alive, and the scholars of the library, working late into the night, often paused to look toward it, a shared moment of stillness. Some said the light danced across the scrolls, casting sacred shadows like a celestial sundial upon the wisdom of the ages. The Pharos was direction, but the labyrinth, that was depth. Deep within the Mouseion, past the reading halls and lecture rooms, there existed a lesser-known chamber, spoken of only in fragments. It was not on any public map, it had no formal name, but among scholars it was simply called the labyrinth. It was a room of winding paths and tiered shelves, alcoves hidden behind curtains, scrolls arranged not by subject but by mystery. Here texts of unknown origin were kept, scrolls that defied classification, manuscripts written in multiple languages, diagrams with no known application, mathematical riddles with no solution, and scrolls said to be so old, even the oldest librarians referred to them with a. The labyrinth was not for the casual reader. It was for those who had walked the spiral of inquiry, who had studied the stars, the body, the spirit, and returned still full of questions. To enter, it was a rite. You brought no ink, no stylus. You came with empty hands and a quiet mind. It is said that one had to solve a riddle before being granted access, a poetic question that changed with each seeker, not to exclude, but to attune, to ensure you were not seeking answers, but deeper questions. In the labyrinth, one scroll whispered of a city beneath the sands of the west, its people vanished into wind. Another bore strange symbols that glowed faintly in firelight, as though the ink remembered light. A third was written entirely in metaphor, a fable of mirrors and towers that some believed to be a coded treatise on the human psyche. No one truly knew who compiled the labyrinth. Some believed it was the work of the earliest scholars, those who had arrived with Alexander's vision and saw Alexandria not merely as a city, but as a key to something greater. Others claimed it had no architect, that, pulled by invisible threads, like dreams gathering in a sleeper's mind. There were rumors, too, that the labyrinth was not merely a place of knowledge, but a place of initiation, that some scholars, after walking its paths, emerged changed, quieter, more contemplative, as though they had glimpsed something beneath reality. One whispered tale speaks of a scroll found in the labyrinth written in no known script. The scholar who found it could not read it but claimed to understand it entirely. When asked what it meant, he only said, "It was a question I had not yet asked." The lighthouse and the labyrinth, one reaching out to sea, one turning inward toward the infinite. Together, they formed a sacred duality, to seek the stars and to seek the soul, to cast light and to dwell in shadow, to guide and to wonder. And perhaps that is what Alexandria truly was, not a city of knowledge, but a city of balance, where inquiry was not rushed, but revered, where the brightest flames stood alongside the darkest question, where light did not banish shadow but danced with it. Tonight, as you drift in quiet contemplation, imagine standing on the library's marble steps, watching the lighthouse fire burn above the harbor, while beneath your feet, the labyrinth waits. One calls you outward, the other inward. Both whisper the same truth: there is more to know. In every sacred place, there are those who walk, and those who wait. While Alexandria's scholars read and reasoned, while healers mixed salves and astronomers charted stars, there existed a quieter class of caretakers rarely named in scrolls, seldom depicted in marble, yet vital to the library's soul. They were the watchers of the threshold, neither philosopher nor scribe, neither poet nor mathematician. These were the quiet guardians, those who stood at the edges of knowledge, at the gates of sanctum and shadow, ensuring that what entered the library was not only seen, but understood. They wore no robes of office. Their names were rarely written, but they were the ones who opened the great doors each morning and shut them again long after the final lamp had dimmed. To the casual eye they may have seemed servants, attendants, custodians of dust and silence. But among the learned, their role was revered. They did not simply guard scrolls. They guarded space as sacred stillness where thought could flourish. They tended to more than marble and flame. They read the room, not for misbehavior, but for imbalance. When a scholar muttered to himself too loudly, the watcher would offer tea, a moment to step outside and feel the sea breeze. When debates grew too heated, a glance from a watcher would remind all that respect was the first rule of wisdom. Some were older, veterans of decades spent among knowledge. Others were young, born of the harbor's salt and the library's shadow, trained not in lecture halls, but through listening. And they listened well. They heard the tremble in a student's voice as they recited their first theorem aloud, the weary sigh of a translator wrestling with an impossible phrase, the hopeful laughter of a botanist discovering a plant referenced in a foreign scroll. The watchers remembered. It is said that one, an old man named Abanon, carried in his mind the full inventory of the whole of astronomy, not because he read every scroll, but because he had watched them being used. He knew which texts scholars returned to most, which ones were handled with trembling hands, which were often taken but rarely understood. He spoke little, but when a new scholar arrived and asked, "Where shall I begin?" he would lead them not to the grand shelves, but to a narrow alcove, to a specific scroll, and simply say, "Here." Years later, those same scholars often confessed that scroll had been exactly what they needed. How did Abanon know? He had watched, and listening, too, was part of their sacred duty. The watchers sat in the quiet corners. They knew the footsteps of each scholar, the sound of frustration in the turning of pages, the rhythm of a stylus when a student finally found clarity. To them, the library was not static, it was alive, and they were its heartbeat. They also guarded the invisible thresholds. When scrolls arrived from distant lands, scented with spice or damp with sea air, it was the watchers who received them, not the scribes, not the philosophers. The watchers carried each crate into the preparation rooms. They would open it slowly, reverently, as though unsealing a tomb or a treasure chest. They knew that knowledge had weight not only physical, but energetic. A scroll of war tactics copied from a conquered kingdom was not treated the same as a scroll of lullabies sung in rice fields. Each was honored, but each required different silence. There were whispers, too, of watchers who tended to the labyrinth, that secret chamber of mystery and depth. They did not speak of what they saw, but they watched those who entered and those who emerged, and they offered something more precious than answers. In an age obsessed with acquisition of land, of wealth, of knowledge, the watchers of Alexandria reminded all who entered that the truest wisdom began not with knowing, but with witnessing. They understood that knowledge was not a ladder, but a threshold, a crossing. One did not rush across, one approached slowly, and in doing so, one changed. Some of the watchers were said to speak more languages than the scholars, but they rarely showed it. Others had never written a single treatise, yet could recite long passages from memory, their voice a steady echo of texts long lost. When the fires came, whether by sword, or politics, or time, it was the watchers who stayed the longest, who carried what they could, who whispered scrolled contents into the ears of those fleeing, begging them to remember. One tale, perhaps myth, speaks of a watcher who stood at the door as flames licked the library's pillars. When asked why he did not run, he said, "Because this place remembers through me." Whether or not that story is true, its spirit is. Because the library did not simply survive in texts, it survived in people, in eyes that had read without speaking, in hands that had carried scrolls with reverence, in hearts that knew wisdom was not just stored, it was guarded, not by walls, but by care. And perhaps tonight, somewhere deep in your memory, one of those watchers stands at the threshold of your thought, waiting, not to judge, but to hold open the door to something wider, to remind you that some knowledge is not found in books, but in the space between breaths. In every place of light, there lies a shadow, not as a contradiction, but as a companion on unseen counterpart that deepens meaning. And within the hallowed halls of the great library, among the scrolls of stars and medicine, of geometry and song, there existed a different kind of manuscript, one not listed in catalogues, not copied in multiples, not spoken of in the daylight. The scholars called it the Scroll of Shadows. Its name does not appear in any surviving index. Its contents are lost, but its legend lingers soft as dusk, persistent as breath. It was said to contain what could not be explained, what could not be classified, tested, or taught. It was the scroll of unanswered questions, of sacred paradoxes, of wisdom that trembled on the edge of comprehension. Not a scroll of secrets in the usual sense, but of those mysteries that resist the grip of reason, the kind that must be held with open hands. The scroll of shadows was not housed in the public halls of the mountain. It was kept elsewhere, some say in the labyrinth. Others claim it moved with the chief librarian, always kept near, yet never read in full. It was not sealed with wax, but with silence. And it was not always the same, for it changed, they whispered, with each reader. To a philosopher, it appeared as a dialogue between gods who disagreed but could not part. To a healer, it was a tale of a wound that could not be seen, but which passed through generations. To a mathematician, it appeared as a pattern that looped back on itself, infinitely simple yet unsolvable. Some claimed it read you, that when you unrolled it, it spoke in your own voice, that it showed you not what you wanted to know, but what you feared to ask. And then, just as suddenly, the ink would fade, as if knowledge could only be glimpsed, not grasped. But why keep such a scroll? Why preserve a puzzle that would not yield, a voice that did not answer? Because the Library of Alexandria was not only a temple of clarity, it was also a sanctuary for the unknown. The scroll of shadows was a reminder placed humbly among the vast seas of knowledge that not all things can be known. That mystery, too, is sacred. The scholars did not study it to master it. They studied it to remain humble. It was their mirror, showing the edges of their understanding, the unfinished corners of their maps, the limits of even the most luminous mind. There were rituals. It is said, one night each season, a chosen scholar would be permitted to unroll the scroll in the Hall of Stars, beneath a dome painted with constellations. Alone, no ink, no fire, only the silver light of moon or lantern. The scroll would be placed upon the table, and the reading would begin. What was seen, or heard, or understood no one ever spoke of. But some returns changed. A mathematician emerged from one such reading and began composing poetry. A physician, after years of research, abandoned his studies to walk the deserts, searching for silence. One astronomer, upon returning, said only this: there is a rhythm older than time. None questioned these transformations. The scroll was not an oracle. It offered no predictions, no commandments, only a presence, a reflection of the inner landscape, and perhaps that was its purpose, to remind the scholars that beyond the stars lay a sky to vast for maps, that beyond the healing arts lay a wound common to all, that beyond knowledge lay something more sacred than certainty. The scroll of shadows was the library's hush, its nightfall, its final breath before sleep, and in its absence now, we inherit its mystery, because we, too, walk the line between light and shadow, between what we know and what we long to know. And perhaps that is the truest knowledge of all, not in answers, but in the courage to ask, and to listen, and to live peacefully with the unspoken. So tonight, dream not only of what you seek to learn, but also of what you are willing to wonder. Let the scroll unroll within you. Let the questions rise without fear. And remember, the greatest wisdom is not shouted from towers. It whispers in the dark. There was no trumpet, no proclamation, no single moment etched in the calendar of time. But there came a day soft, unmarked serapha when the Library of Alexandria no longer spoke. It was not that the scrolls burned that day, nor that the scholars vanished in a single breath, but slowly, and then suddenly, the voices stopped. That day has many possible names. Some call it the day of the final fire. Others point to riots, or the rising of new empires. But history does not always end with a bang. Sometimes it ends in neglect, in doors left unopened, in shelves gathering dust, in silence left unanswered. Let us return there for just a moment. The once radiant marble of the Mouseion is dulled by time and ash. The gardens, once geometric in perfection, have grown wild and fragrant, as though nature seeks to reclaim what was built from her bones. The water basins stand still, their surfaces unmoved, reflecting only the cracked ceiling above, and the scholars, gone, some have fled, some have perished, some have simply forgotten how to return. A lone figure wanders the remaining corridor, a watcher, perhaps, or a devoted apprentice who cannot accept that the library has fallen. They trail their hand along a wall that once echoed with the names of galaxies and gods. Now, only dust answers. They open a scroll, a fragment that somehow remains, and begin to read aloud. Their voice is steady, though it wavers slightly, as if uncertain whether the walls still remember how to listen. And then they stop, mid-sentence, not because the scroll ends, but because the meaning is vanished. The ink is still visible. The letters remain, but the life between the words, the breath, the context, the lineage of listening is gone. That was the true death of the library, not in the loss of parchment, but in the breakage of connection. Knowledge is not kept in objects. It is kept in relationships between teacher and student, question and answer, breath and silence. When those relationships fracture, the words fall silent. And on that day, when the last breath of the library escaped into the sea wind, it was as though the city itself lowered its eyes in grief. The lighthouse still stood, but its fire felt colder. The harbor remained, but its waters were quieter. The people went on with their lives. Traders bartered, priests prayed, sailors mended nets. But something had shifted. A pulse had stopped. A candle had gone out, not with a gust, but with the soft exhaustion of a flame that had burned for too long, too brightly. Yet even in its silence, the library did not disappear. It dissolved into myth, into memory, into dreams that no longer knew their source. And in doing so, it scattered its essence across the world. Its scrolls became seed. Some were planted in Bazaar, some drifted into the Islamic world, where scholars in Baghdad and would translate, protect, and expand them. Some took root in the quiet monasteries of Europe, copied by candlelight by hands who never knew their origin. Some passed into stories, into fables of lost wisdom, into the whisper that somewhere there had once been a place where all the world's knowledge lived in one breath. And in this way the library became not a location but a longing, a yearning not just for facts, but for wholeness. For a world where stars, herbs, poems, and languages could live side by side, respected equally, studied with patience, tended with love. So yes, the words fell silent, but in their silence, they became an echo. And echoes are not endings, they are beginnings that refuse to be forgotten. As you close your eyes tonight, feel the quiet, not as absence, but as invitation. The invitation to listen for the voice beneath silence. The voice that still speaks, softly, patiently, waiting to be heard once more. Even after the walls crumbled, even after the scrolls turned to ash and the wind carried their dust across continents, Alexandria did not die. It transformed, like a river that disappears beneath the earth only to rise again in a distant spring. The soul of the library flowed silently through history, taking root in other places, other minds, other dreams. These are the afterlives of Alexandria. They are not copies. They are echoes, reverberations of a vision so profound it could not be contained by marble or parchment. Long after the last scholar walked the marble floors of the Mouseion far to the east, in the shining halls of Baghdad, a new library bloomed. They called it the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. There, beneath the stars of Mesopotamia, scholars gathered once more Persian, Arab, Jewish, Christian, Indian. They translated Greek scrolls preserved by memory and chance. They expanded upon Alexandrian mathematics, corrected Ptolemaic star charts, and refined philosophical debates first born on the banks of the Nile. In their candlelit chambers, they revived what Alexandria had begun. They did not merely imitate it, they honored its spirit. And then, centuries later, in the monastic libraries of medieval Europe, scribes copying ancient texts would pause mid-sentence and wonder, who first wrote these words? Often they did not know. But behind every diagram, every scrap of Euclid, every page of Galen, every echo of Aristotle, there lingered a breath from Alexandria. In Toledo and Damascus, scrolls were translated from Greek to Arabic, from Arabic to Latin, from Latin to the common tongue, like a sacred chant passed across generations, each version imperfect, each version alive. Even the Renaissance, that great flowering of art, science, and curiosity, owed its roots to seeds planted in Alexandria. Da Vinci sketched machines inspired by Heron. Copernicus challenged the stars with questions first asked under the Pharos light. Kepler traced the orbits first mapped in whispers beneath the library dome. And today, in every modern university, every observatory, every library where the curious gather to read and write and wonder, the flame still flickers. In the Library of Congress, in Oxford's Bodleian, in Paris's Mouseion, in Tokyo, Cairo, Delhi, Buenos Aires, Alexandria breathes again. But it also lives in quieter places. In the home of a child who reads late into the night by flashlight, tracing constellations on their bedroom ceiling. In the garden of a healer who studies ancient plants to restore balance. In the notebook of a poet who sees music in equations and numbers in moonlight. These are not merely students. They are inheritors. The library lives in them not because they have read the right scrolls, but because they hold the right questions. The ancient questions, the ones the library never tried to answer completely. Where do we come from? What lies beyond the stars? How does the soul measure time? And so Alexandria has many afterlives, some of stone, some of ink. It lives in dreams, in the very idea that all knowledge, sacred and scientific, mythic and mathematica, can belong together, without division, without fear. That to learn is not to conquer, but to listen. That a scroll is not an answer, but a doorway. That wisdom begins not with certainty, but with awe. And perhaps that is why the library could never truly be rebuilt, because it was never just a building. It was a way of seeing. Tonight, as your breath slows and the stars begin to shimmer in your imagination, know this: Alexandria is not behind us, it is within us. Every time we ask with humility, every time we listen with reverence, every time we dare to dream of a world where all knowledge, all beauty, all wonder belongs in the same breath, that is the library's afterlife. And it is only just beginning. Beneath the stone foundations of Alexandria, beneath the sunlit porticos and columns of the ancient library, there was something older, deeper, more enduring than parchment or marble. The sea it whispered beneath everything. Long before the first scroll was ever unfurled, the tides washed these shores with rhythmic precision, pulling memory back into the deep, pushing forgotten fragments ashore. The sea was the library's first librarian, the earth's first archivist. Its waters carried stories before alphabets were born, and it never stopped listening. Even today, divers off the coast of modern Alexandria find ruins hidden beneath the waves, sphinx, shattered statues, pieces of forgotten harbors swallowed by tremors and time. What was once land is now ocean floor, a silent archive where sunken stones cradle memories. It is there, beneath shimmering blue-green light, that pieces of the library may still rest. Not scrolls, they would never survive the Sultan centuries, but whispers of architecture, outlines of once great structures now cloaked in coral and sediment. In the sunken district near the island of Pharos, archaeologists have found massive stone blocks and ancient walls. Some believe remnants of the Mouseion or its satellite buildings sleep beneath the waves, protected not by wars, but the sea does not forget. It holds everything. If you were to dive there, in the quiet between breaths, you might feel it not just history, but presence, not ruin, but remembrance. For water holds memory, and Alexandria's harbor was once its lifeblood. From across the ancient world, ships arrived bearing more than goods. They carried knowledge. Each vessel brought scrolls, languages, instruments, myths, formulas, and before they could dock, they were inspected. Every scroll aboard was temporarily seized, copied, and then returned. The originals, some say, were kept to see witnessed it all. The sailors trading stories in unknown dialects. The scholars rushing down stone piers to greet incoming men. The watchers observing from shore, noting the arrival of wisdom cloaked in salt. And when storms came, as they always did, and the fires rose, and the scrolls were lost, the sea remained. It took nothing. It only received. There are stories of scrolls thrown into the water in desperation, hidden from invaders, meant to be recovered when peace returned. Most were surely dissolved, lost to time, but perhaps a few were wrapped in wax or oilcloth, buried in sealed jars, set upon the sea like prayers. Modern science may never find them, but the library was never meant to be fully recovered, only remembered. And what better vessel for memory than the sea? The sea, which sings in every shell, which mirrors the stars in its midnight stillness, which carries the scent of old paper, of ink and salt and silence. And so, the sea beneath the scrolls became something more, a metaphor, a reflection of the soul of the library itself, deep, unknowable, alive. Just as the scrolls held thoughts between their lines, the sea holds worlds between its waves. And when the library vanished from land, it found a new home in water, not in form, but in essence. And perhaps that is why Alexandria always returns in dreams with the sound of waves. Why even now, as you rest, the rhythm of your breath begins to match the rhythm of tide. Inhale, the scroll arrives. Exhale, the scroll is couped. Inhale, the ship sails in. Exhale, the sea remembers. Tonight, let the sea beneath the scrolls cradle you. Let it rock you into sleep, as it once rocked the ships that carried knowledge to Alexandria. And if you dream of ink on water, of stars reflected on waves, of forgotten words rising like bubbles to the surface, know that you are not dreaming alone. You are drifting on the same sea the ancients knew, and it remembers everything. In the story of Alexandria, the fire is not the end. For though the scrolls turned to ash, though the voices fell silent, though the marbled halls were reduced to ruin, something waited deep, patient as if time itself had paused its breath. And then, slowly, the light returned. Not the same light that once poured through alabaster skylights onto ink-stained hands, not the flickering fire of lamps beside scrolls. This was a different light reborn, refracted through centuries of longing, lit by the yearning of countless dreamers who had never set foot in Alexandria, but who carried its spirit in their hearts. It rose not in marble, but in memory. And in 2002, on the same shore where the library once stood, that memory took form again. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern tribute, a resurrection not of architecture, but of intention. Its roof, a great slanted disk of sun-reflecting glass, leans toward the sea like an eye turned to the horizon. Its walls bear inscriptions in over 120 languages, as if to say, we remember what was lost and we will not lose it again. Inside, the new library does not try to replicate the old. It does not house the original scrolls. It does not claim to be the most. Instead, it becomes a beacon, a bridge from past to future, a promise that light, once kindled, may flicker, but will not die. It hosts manuscripts and digital archives, exhibitions and lectures, dreams whispered in binary and bronze. It stands not only as a place of learning, but as a gesture of reverence, an echo made visible. And yet, the true return of the light is not in any one building. It is in us. Every time we pause before a question, every time we protect a fragile truth, every time we teach a child a story, a name, a song passed down from before memory, every time we search the stars and still feel, we are rebuilding the library, not with limestone or cedar, but with courage and curiosity. with the refusal to let wonder wither, with the understanding that knowledge is not possession, it is connection. And in that spirit, the light returns, the same light that glowed on the desk of Eratosthenes as he calculated the size of the earth, the same light that warmed Hypatia's hands as she drew the motion of stars, the same light that danced across the scroll of shadows, flickering truths, half seen, half felt. In every corner of the world where a mind asks, what if? In every heart that believes wisdom can still be sacred, in you. And though we will never recover all that was lost, perhaps we were never meant to. Perhaps the library's final lesson was this: that what is most valuable cannot be destroyed, that fire cannot burn questions, that time cannot erase longing, that truth, once spoken, echoes forever. And so, dreamer, as you drift now beneath your own sky, know that the light has returned. It lives in your wonder. It glows in your silence. It waits in your dreams. Alexandria is not behind us. It is within us. And as long as we carry it, the library is not lost. It is becoming. As our journey through the vanished library of Alexandria draws to a close, let these ancient whispers settle into your consciousness like morning mist over forgotten ruins. We have wandered the marble corridors of memory, listened to the breath of vanished scholars, and traced the curves of lost scrolls in the dark. We have seen how stars were named, how wounds were healed, how words were translated not just across languages but across time. We have stood beneath the lighthouse and walked the labyrinth. We have heard the chants of healers, the laughter of philosophers, and the sigh of parchment turning to ash. And through it all, we have seen that the library was never merely a building. It was a dream that knowledge could be gathered without boundaries, that curiosity could be sacred, that all the wisdom of the world could live together, side by side, under one roof of silence and wonder. That dream was not destroyed into the house of wisdom, into monasteries and observatories, into homes and hands, into stories whispered in sleep, and now, into you. If tonight's journey has brought you peace, if the quiet breath of history has lulled your thoughts towards stillness, consider becoming a regular traveler on these mystical paths. Subscribe to join our circle of dreamers, and let the gentle chime of each new story guide you back into history's hidden realms. Share your thoughts about tonight's voyage, how these ancient voices spoke to your spirit, and tell us from where in the world you joined this quiet procession through time. Until we meet again, in dreams or in ink, in scroll or in starlight, may your rest be filled with the gentle echoes of knowledge not yet forgotten. Sleep well, dear dreamer, and may the light of Alexandria guide your path forevermore.